Thank you so much for joining us. Holly's going to talk through the resources available to you when discussing life story work with your children, how best to approach that, something that lots of us need some help with, might struggle with, or just need a little bit of motivation, a bit of direction from where to start. So thank you very much, Holly. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Hi everyone, so I'm Holly Marlow. I'm a mum. I have two children, a 7-year-old birth child and a nearly 4-year-old adopted son who has been with us since he was 13 months old. And life story work has been really important to me, working with him to help him to understand where he came from and who he is, so because he's forming his own identity. And I've also had to explain adoption to my daughter. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I talked to my son about adoption, and then how I prepared Zoe, and how I've explained various things to her along the way. Because she's a bit older, she can understand a bit more. I'm going to talk about some of the common resources that you'll have heard of, and how I came up with a sort of script for explaining his life story to him, and how I've evolved that over time. And I'll talk about how I've done life story work just in everyday life, as well as things like the life story books that most of you will have heard of and hopefully have a copy of. You get quite a lot of different resources from different places when you have an adopted child. And the first things that you'll typically get are from the social workers. So you might get a life story book. We have a lovely life story book. I won't show you the details of it, but you can see it's quite a thick book, and it's all bound together. It's great, it's really detailed, and it's exactly what we need, but it's not something that I can use with my boy who's only 3 at the moment. So we have looked at it, we've dipped into it, but there's a lot of other stuff that we've done kind of building up to that I'll talk about. I will say that if you are using a life story book, there's quite a few things, or sorry, if you're receiving a life story book, there's quite a few things that you should check before you accept it. So ask your social worker to send you an electronic version if you haven't got your life story book already, and make sure that it starts with where your child is now, to kind of ground them before you start delving into all the emotional stuff about where they came from. So you start with now and finish with the future. And those are 2 steps that are quite often missed out, and they can make a really big difference, I think, in grounding a child and having them to remember that the important stuff is that they're in your family. When I say finish with the future, it should be talking about how they're going to stay with you, and they'll live with you and be part of your family forever, even if they move, and even if they get married and change their name, they'll still be part of your family. It's also really important that you do use the book from social workers. So a lot of adoptive parents will get frustrated because they'll receive life story books that they feel are inadequate if the social worker hasn't had training, or sadly in a lot of cases the social worker who knows your child will leave during the process, and so someone else ends up writing it, which can be quite frustrating. So some people just get frustrated and end up thinking, fine, I'll just write my own. And by all means do that as well. But I do think it's really important that you have a life story book from the social workers, because they're a voice of authority as far as your child is concerned. And at some point, potentially when they're a teenager, they're bound to think, oh, my parents are just telling me this because this is a version of events that they want me to hear, for whatever reason. And so I think it's really good if part of their story at least has come from the social worker, so that it's got that weight of authority behind it. Make sure you also check that the life story book has lots of personal anecdotes in there, as much as you can drag out of the social worker who's met them, and share anything that you learned during intros with the foster family, so that there's some just snippets of humanity in there. So it's you need it to say why the child was removed, because that's the voice of authority explaining why. But it's also nice if you've got some things like, and these were their favourite hobbies, your birth family liked these things and had these interests. Also make sure that they use their first names when talking about the birth family, because that can be quite tricky to explain to a young child if it's littered with mummy and mum and sorts of references like that you probably wouldn't use to describe your child's birth parents. So that's a life story book. And I'm not going to dwell too much on that because there's so much other stuff that you can use to talk to your children. Obviously, you also get court documents from the social workers, and you get the later in life letter from the family finder. Some agencies will do a later in life letter from the birth family or from other social workers who've been involved in the case. And you might get them from the foster family too. But with those, you're not going to be reading those to your child from a young age. But I would recommend that you read them thoroughly yourself so that you can use snippets of them in an age-appropriate way when you're talking about the birth family. So that's all the stuff that you get from social workers. There's also quite a lot of stuff that you get from foster carers, which people don't necessarily think of as tools for life story work. So I just want to touch on some of those. And so we got a memory box, which is a very common tool that foster carers will provide. And just as an example of some of the things that were included in there, we've got this tiny little t-shirt, which is the thing my son was wearing when he first went into foster care. And it's just really useful to be able to pick this up every now and then and just show him how tiny he was when he went to live with the foster carers. And I've also got a copy, I've also got the first t-shirt that we bought for him, so that we can say, look how much you've grown, you know, you were this small, and look how much you grew when you were in foster care, when you were living with your foster family. And I think being able to visualize things helps my son to kind of process it and see that that was quite a long time, because he's grown a lot. So that you'll get all sorts of different things in memory books depending on what happened to your child and what the foster care thought was important to keep. I really hope that everybody gets one of these. This is probably the most valuable thing we received, and it's the thing I'd grab if we had a fire. It's a little contact book that the foster carer used when my son was having contact with his birth family. And so she wrote in it things like, Jake's had a really good night's sleep. He's probably going to need a nap at 11. He didn't eat very much for breakfast, so he'll need some snacks. That sort of thing, you know, or he hasn't slept well, he's teething at the moment, you might need to put some gel on his gums. Just things like that, which is nice for my son to have and understand when he's a bit older. But there's also some snippets in here because she included a pen for the birth parents to write back. So the birth parents wrote back at the end of every session saying how it had gone. And again, a lot of this is not particularly revolutionary stuff, it's just what kind of mood he was in when he slept and ate. But you can see things like how they write and their handwriting. And it would be nice to be able to show him whose handwriting he has, or whose handwriting is most similar to his. I can tell from this that his birth father is most likely left-handed and my son is left-handed. That doesn't run in the family, so it's just a coincidence. It's not a genetic thing. But being left-handed is quite an isolating thing. Sometimes my son is the only one in our family who's left-handed, so it's nice to be able to say to him, actually, birth father is left-handed too. And more importantly, you can tell from here that one of his birth parents has a really great sense of humour, and it's just nice to be able to share with my son that he probably gets his sense of humour from that parent, and to humanise them, because they're not terrible people, as I'm sure most of the birth parents of children will be. So it's nice to be able to share that stuff. Another thing that was really valuable was a list from the foster carer saying, listing all the clothing, the books and the toys that he was given while he was in their care, or that he came with, and who they came from. And in some cases it says if they were received for a birthday or something, or whatever the occasion was. If you don't have one of those and you're in contact with your foster family, or if you haven't adopted yet and you don't get one, make your own, because it's been so valuable for us. Contact them and ask, you know, where did all these things come from, who gave them to him, and try and fill in some of those gaps. Because now that he's old enough to talk, he's asking me where these things come from, and he loves to hear it. And especially some of them, we've got little snippets of information like, this was the book that his birth mother had when she was a child and she enjoyed it, that kind of thing. So it humanises them, and it, I keep saying humanises, but I really want to humanise them in his life and to show that he can talk to me about them. And I'm not just going to say negative things, and I'm going to share all sides of them with him. so that he knows that I accept all of him, including his birth family, and also so that he knows that he can talk to me about them and not hopefully meet up with them in secret when he's a teenager or something. We also got a photo album from the foster carers, which we go through quite a lot. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. And more importantly, we got a lot of anecdotes from them while we were doing the intros. So I've written down as many of those as I can, so that I remember them, because I'm sure my memory won't always be this great. And I like to remind him of the funny things that they did together, and just little stuff like his foster brother taught him how to throw a ball. He's really into any kind of ball game, so he loves knowing that he's still got that connection with his foster brother, even though they're not together anymore. So we also have quite a lot of resources from my son's birth family, and this is something that will vary from child to child. But I wanted to talk about these because, again, these are things that people don't necessarily think of as being part of life story work. So we've got things like the books and toys from them, and we talk about them. We've also got letterbox contact, which we are really, really fortunate to have. Even if you don't get replies, I think letterbox contact is an important part of your child's story. And for a long time, I didn't receive any replies, but I thought I want my part in this chapter of the story, if you will, to be as positive as possible. And when he looks back, I want him to see that I did all I could to keep that door open for him. So I asked them loads of questions in the letters to try and encourage them to reply. And I always included a reminder at the end of the letter of where they should send their replies to, in case they couldn't find the letterbox agreement, because they've moved house a few times and things go missing. So I just wanted to make it as easy as possible. And it occurred to me sometime last year that I could make it even easier by including a stamped addressed envelope. So I now do that, and I address it to the letterbox team in the adoption agency. And since doing that, I've been getting replies. So that has been life-changing for us. And I would really, really recommend doing that if you don't already. Because we receive wonderful replies now, and they're from one of his birth parents, and they've answered loads of questions and talked to us about and shared with us things like their favourite stories when they were a child, and games they used to play, things that they used to do, crafting things they used to do. So I've been able to do those things with Jake, and then I can also tell them in my replies that we've done that. So that's kind of furthering that relationship, and that's giving us more and more stuff to share with my son, and also hopefully help him in the future if he wants to have a relationship with them. I hope he will. There's also usually an opportunity to have a meeting between the birth family and the adoptive family, and sometimes there's direct contact. And I would encourage you to try to remember that both of these are opportunities for life story work for your child. You're going to be able to talk to your child about these things. So go into it with that kind of mindset, and take those as questions, and don't be afraid to ask them things that might sound silly or childish, because you have a child. It's okay. It's fine to ask them, what's your favorite color? You know, what kind of car do you have, and what's your favorite dinosaur? All these things are important to a child. Write them all down. So I mentioned a script earlier. I started talking to my son when he was about 13 months old about his life story, and I would recommend doing that because it's worked really well for us, because I've been able to practice and iron out all the kinks in my speech. So I needed a bit of time to figure out whether I wanted to call them birth parents, biological parents, first parents, or use their names. I tend to use their names, although when I'm talking here, I'm not going to do that. So I tend to do that. So I started young so that I could kind of get the hang of it before he could ask me questions. Some of you won't have that luxury, and you'll be asked questions right away if you've adopted an older child, but I still think it's important to start as young as possible. And so I started really simply, and I've kind of evolved the script over time as he's become older and able to understand more things. So initially I would just say, I'll get a photo of our family, because in the same way as you do with the life story book, you want to start with now. So I'll get a photo of our family, which I've strategically put in front of our photo albums of birth family and foster family, so that I will not forget this step. And I look at that photo with him and I would say, look, that's mummy, that's daddy, that's Zoe, she's your big sister, there's you. And we're the Marlows, we're a family, we all live together and we love each other. And then I would get out the photo album of the birth family we're very lucky to have. Basically using some of the stuff from the life story book and some other photos that we've managed to extract from social workers after the final meeting and other occasions. So we look at that book and I say, look, that's so-and-so and so-and-so. You grew in so-and-so's tummy and they cuddled you and they loved you. Then you went to live with the foster family, and I'd then move on to the foster family album and show him photos of them. He was always much more interested in that and he really wanted to skip to it, but I made sure we stuck with the birth family photos anyway, because although you can't remember them, the more we go through it, the more that becomes part of our routine, and he's interested and starts to ask more questions. So I'd do all that, I'd go through it, and then I'd talk about the future. And I'd say, like, as I'm putting all the albums away, I'd point to that photo of us again and saying, now you live with us and we're the Marlow family. And I'd be quite repetitive and it would be extremely annoying for a much older child, but for a young child, it was exactly what he needed. He loves repetition, as so many young children do. And I think it helped him to feel safe. So we went through that same script once or twice a week. I'd do it more often if he was struggling emotionally, because seeing photos of his foster family calmed him down. I think for a long time he felt like I was trying to replace his foster mum, which of course I was, and he was cross about that. So showing him that she's still part of our life and that I still talk about her seems to really help. And it definitely made him much less angry with me at the beginning. So over time, I added in more details that were age appropriate. So I would explain that the social worker was a bit worried that they weren't going to look after him properly. So he went to live with the foster carer, blah, 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 same story again. And then the next time I added in that social worker was a bit worried, so she went to talk to the judge, and the judge decided that he should go to live with the foster carer. And I'd also added that the judge decided that he should come to live with us and live with his family. So I just gradually built on it, and then he was old enough to start asking me questions that have helped it to evolve more naturally. I'm sure for many of you that was kind of teaching me to suck eggs, but for some people that just coming up with that initial script can be really overwhelming. So I wanted to go through it to kind of give you an example and a baseline if you just don't know where to start with talking to your child about adoption. I mentioned that we do life story work every day, and that is really important to me. So we draw parallels in our life. So I'll say things like, I'm your mummy, so you need to hold my hand when we cross the road because I'm your mummy and I need to keep you safe, because parents keep their children safe. And that's reinforcing, that's kind of creating a foundation for when I talk about how the social worker had worries that maybe he wasn't going to be safe, so those people couldn't be his parents. And also similarly, when I'm giving him medicine, if he's sick, I'll say, you do need to take this, and I need you to take it because I'm your mum, and parents have to keep their children healthy and to be healthy. It's just reinforcing and creating a foundation for all that life story work that we do. Another thing that's really important is, again, talking about the future, is proving it to my son. So I felt for a long time like he didn't really believe that I was going to stick around. And we had some attachment issues where he was quite anxious. So I basically try to inject myself into his future whenever I can. So if he says, oh, Mom, look at that car, I'll say, yeah, that's a really cool car. Are you going to have one like that when you're grown up? Will you drive me around in it? Where will you take me? And he'll say a few places, usually like he wants to take me to Suppley or the beach or something. And I'll say, oh, that sounds fun. And then when I'm really, really old, will you take me to the beach and we can just sit there and I'll just read a book? And I try and talk about when I'm really, really old so that he knows I'll still be in his life then as well. And another thing I've done to show him that he's staying with us is to keep some clothes that are far too big for him in his room. So we've got 2 drawers in his room, which is excessive really, but of entirely clothes that are too big for him. And some of them are massive, you know, he's probably going to be an adult by the time he fits them. But he's really excited to see them every now and then, and he asks me if he can have a look at the clothes for when he's older. So it's obviously giving him some kind of reassurance. And if I can tell that he's getting a bit wobbly, I'll find an excuse to accidentally open the wrong drawer so that I can show him that and say, oh yeah, remember this, you know, this is that t-shirt we got that looks really cool, but it's not going to fit you until you're a teenager. But that's all right, you know, you will fit it one day. Just to help, and it does help. It makes a big difference. Another thing I do is we do a lot of role play with dinosaurs. I don't know if that's in focus. We've just got probably about 20 or 30 of these plastic dinosaurs, and you can obviously use dolls or whatever your child's into. But we do a lot of role play where we sort these different dinosaurs into families, and we have birth families, foster families, and adoptive families, and a few social worker dinosaurs as well. My son really enjoys arranging them all. He does it himself now, actually, even if I'm not involved. But initially I would instigate this kind of play with him to help him to understand how everyone's linked and to process it. And just to normalise it as well in his life so that he doesn't feel like adoption's an unusual thing. Sometimes we just sort them into families, sometimes we show them meeting up, and sometimes we role play the whole removal and then living with this family for a while and then moving on to an adopted family. So that's how we do life story work kind of every day. We also use TV shows. So there are so many TV shows now that are starting to use same-sex parents, which makes it really easy to point out that because he doesn't really understand the birds and the bees as such, but he knows that to create a child, you need a man and a woman. So I'm able to say, oh, look, in that program, they've got 2 mums. So how have they got children? Do you think they've adopted their children? And that sort of thing. So we use, obviously, Hey Dougie seems to be the one that most people have heard of. There's a crocodile called Happy, who's got an elephant mum. We used that one right from the start. There's also a program called Chip and Potato, and in season 3 they introduce some gay dads who have baby twins. So I've said, oh, look, they've probably adopted their twins, and it's just nice to normalise it really and talk a bit about how that might have happened. And there's similarly, Amazon have got a program called Bug Diaries, which has got 2 worms, worm mums who have children, and technically worms can produce without any other worm. They can produce eggs actually, but we ignored that for the purpose of life story work and talked about how maybe they've adopted their children. One that's getting more useful now that he's a little bit older is Dinosaur Train. There's a dinosaur character called Buddy who he's born into a pteranodon nest. He's a T-Rex, but he doesn't know he's a T-Rex at first, and 1 or 2 of the series are trying to figure out what kind of dinosaur he is, who he is, where he came from. And we use that to talk about how it must be really frustrating for him that he doesn't know anything about his life. And I said, no, can you imagine if you didn't know about this and this and this? And I'll throw in some life story facts. And it makes him understand that I'm sharing this information with him and that this is stuff that he should know. Not because I'm trying to make him feel grateful that he knows, but because I'm trying to make him understand that this is important information that is part of his life, and that I value that information and I see that it is important for him to know it. And of course, I'm sure many of you are expecting me to talk about books because some people know that I am now a children's book author. I started writing books to explain adoption to my children. So we use books a lot to normalise adoption and also to explain it. So the first book that I wrote was Debbie Duck. I now have a sibling version of that as well. And it talks about why some children can't live with their birth families. and it leaves some room for interpretation. So there's lots of different metaphors in there, so you can use it to explain if there were memory and concentration problems, whether that's from both parents having their own trauma, or a mental health condition, or learning disability, or an addiction. All of those things you can make the metaphor mean what you want it to mean, really. It also shows social work support, so that you can explain that it wasn't a decision that someone came to lightly. You can see that there's lots of help given before the child's removed. Another thing that we have needed to explain to my son is the different outcomes from foster care, because he had foster siblings who have moved into different placements. So some went into kinship placements, some stayed with foster carers in long-term placements, and some have returned to birth family. So there's quite a lot for a child to understand, that once he's learned his own story and his own path, it's quite a lot for him to then understand that the same thing didn't happen to those other children. So I created this one for him. So this is Room in the Nest, and it talks about all the different outcomes of foster care. So it shows family who are reunified, kinship care, adoption, long-term foster care. There's a metaphor in there that you can use as either long-term foster care or foster to adopt. Essentially, a judge decides that those children are going to stay with their foster family rather than moving on to adoption or elsewhere. So that's kind of all how I talk to my son about his adoption. I also mentioned that I have a birth daughter, and so I had to do some work to prepare her and to help her understand. She has a lot more questions, and I would say one of the hardest things about having a birth child when you adopt is knowing where to draw the line and when to share things about your adopted child's life and when to kind of be vague, because I feel like my daughter deserves to know what happened to her brother to an extent, but he deserves for his story to be protected and respected, and in some cases I think he should be the first one to know some of the facts. So sometimes I'll use Deli Duck or Room in the Nest to say, it's a bit like when this character did this, rather than going into the specifics of his story. And so I can kind of be a bit vague, but also feel like I'm not entirely fobbing her off. But it is a very difficult balance, for sure. So I've created a couple of resources for birth siblings. So my daughter helped me with these. So we have, this book is to explain the process and explore the frustrations and positives that a child might be feeling while preparing for their adopted sibling to join the family. And it talks about the social workers coming around and that kind of thing, and what it's like to have introductions when a child's in foster care. And then this one, So You've Adopted a Sibling, is for after placement. And this one is the book that we really needed, to be honest. My daughter had a lot of feelings about my son suddenly moving in and already having a routine that we were trying to protect, because obviously he was going through such drastic change. So I was trying to keep things the same for him, but of course that was impacting her routine. So it talks about some kind of coping strategies and problem solving in a child appropriate way. It's suitable for birth children and also for previously adopted children if you're adopting a second or third or more, if you're very brave. And there's also a cousins version of the first one. So this is the preparing for adoption kind of book. So if you want to talk about other children in your extended family about adoption, you can use that one to explain the process and what's happening if you're an auntie or uncle or whatever. So those are all the resources that I have created myself, and I've talked a bit about the other stuff that we use. Something that I offer is I do school visits where I can read some of these books. So I can do them remotely if you're not close to me. And I have quite a few different ones. So I do just a normalizing type thing where I'll talk about adoption and I'll read Room in the Nest. I'll talk about different types of family. Room in the Nest also features a couple with 2 mums and a single parent family in there. And so I'll just kind of point them out, and I'll talk about lots of different family structures as I go through it. So that's quite a popular one. But I also do sibling visits to help prepare a child for adoption, because a lot of the time people forget about the support network of the child who's already in the family. And I really enjoy doing those, because it's lovely, because the children all kind of rally around and they get really excited for their friend, because they're going to adopt, they're going to have a baby brother or sister join their family by adoption. And it's really precious to see how excited they get. It's adorable. And they ask really sensible questions usually, some wild, crazy ones, but they're sweet too. So yeah, I can do that to help with your child's support network. So just get in touch if you would like me to do that. And I also do sort of a celebratory one. If you've just had your celebration hearing, then I'll do one to talk about adoption and different kinds of family. Anyway, I hope this seminar webinar has made life story work a bit less daunting for you. And if you've got any questions, please let me know. I can't see any yet.
Holly, you are so on it with the life story work. I would never ever think about using like clothes that are too big for them to just re-emphasize that they're going to be there for the long haul. I just think that's so imaginative. That's fab. Well done. We do have some questions, so I'll just go to those if that's okay with you. So one question, we've never heard of a contact book. Do all foster carers have to keep one?
They don't all have to keep one. So if you haven't got one, that's sad. I'm sorry to hear that. But you should have some sort of record of any interactions that they had with birth family, because they do have to keep a daily record of what's happened. Usually you wouldn't get a copy of that, but you should be able to access it if you want more information. There might be some detail in there that you could use instead.
Lovely, thank you. Do you get sent drafts of the life story book from the social workers? If so, are you able to request amendments and okay the final version, or did you have to push for all the edits?
You should be sent a draft by email. One issue that I think a lot of people have is that social workers don't always last for very long. I think they tend to be moved around, particularly if something urgent happens in one department. I found social workers would be whipped off the job and pulled elsewhere. So I ended up with some quite junior social workers working on our life story book who didn't really know what to do. And so I requested that they send me a copy by email, but that should be normal practice anyway. You can ask for edits, as many as you feel is appropriate to get it exactly right, and they should make those provided that they're true. Absolutely. Yeah,
because at the end of the day, it's going to be you presenting that information, isn't it? And you know how your child is going to be receiving it. I think you've covered these brilliantly. Do you have any tips for welcome books?
Welcome books. Oh, yeah. So it depends really on the age of the child. So my son was quite young, so I had one of these sort of bendy. It's almost like it's made of. So it looks like a thin cushion that you can slot photos in. So I had one of those. So it's a very simple photo book. But I've seen some brilliant storybooks for children recently that made me think that if I'd been adopting an older child, there's quite a lot of stuff I would have done differently. So if you're adopting a child who's old enough to do baking, for example, you could include in your welcome book little copies of recipes that you're going to make together, that kind of thing, because it will help them with any kind of food insecurity, to see that baking is something that you do and you have food in your family. Another thing that I thought was quite a good idea was including stencils to show that you like to do arts and crafts together and that kind of thing. I think if you can find out from foster care what the child's into, then you can kind of personalise it and include activity type of things so that they can do some stuff while they're thinking about you and thinking, oh, this is from my new mum or my new dad.
A great idea. Lovely. This is a question that I'd like to know as well, because I am also a mum and an auntie by adoption. What age group is cousins by adoption suitable for?
So it's about 3 to, I always kind of pitch it for about 3 to 8, but I do know someone used it for her 10-year-old recently, and she seemed to appreciate it. So perhaps it's wider than I thought.
Yeah, and then I think sometimes the older ones that want to act too cool to be involved in those stories, but actually what I find in my family, because we've got age between 5 and 9, if I'm reading the 5-year-old a story that might be deemed too childish in theory for the old ones, they'll just sort of sidle in, and the next thing you know, they're all sat down reading it, but they don't want to admit that they're listening to it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, it might be a case of that. Also a tricky one, when would you tell nieces or nephews they don't know how long the matching process will take, and they are currently 10 and 6?
So well, with my daughter, we told her quite early on in the process, and I would have done the same if I did have one niece actually, and I did tell her about the same time, so I told them basically at the point when social workers were starting to come and interview us. I said that we'd like to adopt a child, but we didn't know if there would be a child who needed a family like ours. And I was always quite careful to emphasize that it's about us being the right family for a child rather than finding the right child to fit into our family, because that's not how it works. And also it shows that it's not a certainty. So I had a bit of wiggle room there to say it's not going to happen if anything went horribly wrong. So I did it pretty early on in stage 1. And then as we got closer to matching and we had a child in mind, we didn't tell our daughter about a specific child until we'd been through matching panel, but we started sort of dropping hints and saying, social workers mentioned that there's some boys and one of them might need a family like ours. She thinks he might need a big sister, so we're going to try and get some more information. Just kind of implying that it was getting closer and doing lots more using TV shows and books to kind of normalise adoption as a thing.
It's really tricky, isn't it? Because their concept of time is so different to ours, and the anticipation is difficult enough for us to manage, let alone a 6-year-old, for example. So yeah, it's a tricky one to balance. I've just got a comment here saying thank you, the webinar was really useful, and I would echo that, Holly. I think there's loads of real practical tips that doesn't have to be let's sit down and clear the table and get out this big book and have a heavy discussion, which I think is really useful, and just to drip feed the information from. And you've just given loads of opportunities that people could use to sort of shoehorn their reference in, that just helps sort of settle that child and put everything into context. Really, really useful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And thanks everyone for joining us this morning. It is all recorded and it'll be available to view on our members resources area by Friday. So thanks for your time, Holly. Thanks so much, and really appreciate you sharing your stories with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye guys. Thanks.